One of the first things that new archaeology students learn about our field is that it's an interdisciplinary endeavor. Archaeology has always incorporated the lessons of other fields in our study of the human past, geology, biology, chemistry, and other physical sciences, as well as more immediately obvious fields like history, linguistics, and of course, cultural anthropology. Every field we can draw inspiration and methodology from adds one more tool in our kit for understanding the human past through its material remains. Unfortunately, even with those tools in our kit, there are still aspects of the human past that remain difficult for us to access. Archaeology is the study of humanity through an inherently blurry filter, the material remains of the past. And aspects of human life that don't directly express themselves in material items are very hard for us to learn about. An excellent example of this is cognitive archaeology, the study of beliefs and ideas and concepts in the past. This is one circumstance where an interdisciplinary approach can be very productive, and I hope to demonstrate that in this slideshow, specifically by showing how the field of folkloristics can give us techniques for identifying the fundamentally non-material through material remains. The case study I'll use to explore this idea comes from the major Mississippian center of Spiro, Oklahoma. Spiro is the westernmost major Mississippian mound center, located along the Arkansas River in northeastern Oklahoma. It is primarily and justifiably famous for the huge collection of elaborately engraved shell and copper artifacts that were, unfortunately, looted from its elite burial mound in the 1930s. Those burials were made sometime around 1400 AD, but the artifacts interred with the elite leaders were probably curated for many generations. We know, for example, that several large stone figurines were originally carved at or near Cahokia in the American Bottom, and that the Braden artistic style, which makes up the bulk of the Spiro shell, originated at Cahokia as well centuries earlier. In the 1940s, the Spiro artifacts were compared to those recovered at Moundville and Etowah to define what came to be called the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. While that concept is now rather outdated as a way of understanding Mississippian art and belief, it shows a close relationship between Spiro and those more eastern sites. Ethnographically, Spiro's inhabitants were almost certainly part of the Caddoan linguistic and cultural tradition. But Cahokia's inhabitants seem to have been ancestors of the historic Osage, and Moundville and Etowah's inhabitants were Muskegean-speaking peoples. Mississippian iconographic styles were thus international in scope, and we should be studying them with an eye to the wider eastern woodlands context, not just those of the eastern plains or the Ozark-Ouachita region. At any rate, it seems reasonable to say, based on the contexts and styles of the Spiro shell, that these artifacts played important roles in the local politics, and the elaborate and detailed images seem almost certainly to be illustrating something. I'm not the first archaeologist to suggest that these engravings are illustrations of folk narratives told by Spiroans. If we could determine what those narratives were, we'd have a major insight into how Spiro leaders justified their positions and how Spiro commoners viewed their world. That's not an easy task, of course. Folk narrative, especially before the invention of a writing system, is a fundamentally transient experience. The storyteller speaks, the audience listens, then the story is gone. Stories can be materialized in iconography, as the Spiro shell apparently does, but without already knowing the stories, returning the static image to a narrative is very difficult. Luckily, archaeology is not wholly without tools for this circumstance, and the most relevant one is the direct historical method, where cultural traits practiced by historical or contemporary peoples are used to interpret the archaeological remains of those peoples' ancestors. This is, in fact, the method used by most Mississippian iconographers, and it has revealed some truly compelling interpretations, including the linking of Cahokia to the modern Osage through Mississippian depictions of the Osage culture hero Redhorn. What I've tried to do in studying the Spiro shell is to approach the whole corpus collectively, and to relate it to much larger, more general folk narrative concepts. To illustrate the approach I've taken, we need first to understand some basic concepts from the field of folkloristics. Folkloristics is about much more than storytelling, but folk narratives happen to be the type of lore relevant here. Folklorists who study narratives recognized very early on that every telling of a story was different and unique. Even the same storyteller telling the same tale to the same audience would perform it differently on a second evening. So rather than dealing directly with texts, folklorists have developed ways to describe their narratives structurally, which allows them to compare and contrast more efficiently. The first stage is to identify the narrative motifs. A narrative motif is the smallest unit of narrative that can be repeated meaningfully across multiple tales. It can occur in very different stories, but always has the same meaning. For example, waking from magic sleep by kiss occurs in Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, and in the tale of Siegfried and Brunhilde. Otherwise, the stories are very different. Narrative motifs are like building blocks. The next stage is to see how a particular tale makes use of those building blocks. A tale type is a broad plot outline that describes how certain motifs are combined to create a whole narrative. Two stories can be very different in detail, but follow the same general plot outline. Beauty and the Beast, for example, tells roughly the same tale as the Roman myth Cupid and Psyche. Disney's Lion King and Hamlet also belong to the same tale type. Different stories that belong to the same type follow the same plot, but use different interchangeable motifs. This can all be related to iconography through a simple analogy. When an artist seeks to illustrate a tale, a narrative motif becomes an iconographic motif, and tale types become compositions. An iconographic motif is a single, meaningful element of a visual image, and when the motifs are combined in certain recognizable relationships, they form a coherent composition. So it's reasonable to say that the inhabitants of Spiro passed their folk narratives down to their historic descendants. Thus, if we know the patterns of narrative motifs and tale types found in modern folk narrative, we can seek those same patterns between iconographic motifs and compositions in the archaeological record. If they're there, then Spiroans probably told tales of that type, though not necessarily in their familiar historic form. So in conducting this research, the first step was to read as many Native American folk tales from the Mississippian region as possible. Next, I cataloged 90 narrative motifs and described 40 tale types that could be constructed from them. Then I examined all the Spiro engraved shell illustrated by Phillips and Brown and described their iconographic motifs. Then I compared the two sets of motifs statistically. I'll spare you the details of applying a hypergeometric variable to a single sample chi-square test of association, and just say that the results I'm going to discuss next are so statistically significant that my software couldn't calculate a precise probability, and simply reported that there was a 0% chance these patterns were random. Several different tale types were shown by the analysis to be in the minds of the Spiro artists. I'll discuss two because they very clearly have implications for Spiro leadership. The first tale type I'll discuss is the shaming of the sun. Briefly, the tale tells of how the sun is shamed by some human action, causing her to follow an erratic and unpredictable path across the sky. Two heroes are dispatched to solve the problem, and in some versions they try to do so by turning into snakes. Initially they fail. On the second try, they succeed. This is sometimes attached to an Orpheus episode, a failed attempt at resurrecting a deceased loved one. This usually involves the daughter of the sun taking the form of a bird. Several individual engravings appear to have especially close relationships to this tale. These are the Craig A. Confronted Figures gorgets. Foremost among the associations here is the fact that the gorgets all have two primary figures, just as the tale has two heroes dispatched to fix the sun's course. Furthermore, several of the gorgets depict several motifs associated with the tale type, and place them in spatial relationships consistent with episodes from the tale type. For example, in the Orpheus episode, the sun's daughter's spirit takes the form of a bird. This suggests that human spirits may have been conceptualized as birds or vice versa. In plate 128, the two main figures are each depicted with a bird sitting on his head. Between their faces is a sun symbol. The central motif of this plate appears to be two intertwined snakes moving away from the sun. The heads of the snakes are missing, but another gorget, plate 337, also uses a snake as a central motif, and this snake has a human head. Putting these details and interpretations together, one can construct the first part of the hero episode. The two heroes, showing their strong spirits, have turned into snakes and traveled to the sun. However, they failed and fled from the sun. This one gorget depicts two different scenes from the tale, the heroes outfitted for their journey, and the same heroes in the form of snakes fleeing the sun. In fact, if the confronted figures gorgets are interpreted as condensing several sequential events into one image, several of the gorgets make more sense. One such engraving is plate 141, if one examines a different variant of the tale type. In this variant, a wizard is attacking the sun daily. The heroes decapitate the wizard and hang his head from a tree. The next morning, the head falls off and rolls around, chasing people. They hang the head from another tree, but the same thing happens. The head refuses to die until it's hung from a very particular tree, the fourth one tried. In plate 141, at least one of the heroes is armed with a club, the weapon with which the wizard is killed. The central motif is a vertical panel decorated with alternating human heads. A horizontal band across the men's waist is also decorated with human heads. Note that the heads are all virtually identical. No attempt is made to differentiate them. Here, the central pattern, or the central panel, could be a condensation of all four trees. Each of the identical heads represents one occasion in which the wizard's head was hung. The horizontal band could represent the rolling head episodes, one head shown at multiple points in the process of rolling. A third gorget that may have a close relationship with the story is 127. It shows two men carrying what appears to be a pot out of which is rising steam. On the back of one man, but not the other, hangs a bird. In the Orpheus episode, the sun's daughter takes the form of a bird when her human resurrection fails. It's possible the interpretation of the central object as a pot and steam is incorrect. Instead, it may be a basket, like those used to carry spirits in Native American Orpheus myths. The steam would then be a rush of air escaping the basket with the spirit. The bird is the spirit after its reincarnation. This gorget depicts at least two events simultaneously, the rush of air and the appearance of the bird. Another tale type present at Spiro is the emergence and migration myth. Most tribes in the Mississippian region tell a tale of this type. In the tale, the tribe emerges from the lower world and migrates eastward, having various adventures along the way. In some stories, every night when the people make camp, the leader stands a pole upright in the ground. In the morning, it leans in the direction they are to travel that day. When the pole remains upright in the morning, they've reached their destination. The emergence itself may be represented in plate 161, where men are shown surrounded by rectangular frames. They're also holding spoon-shaped objects against the ceiling of their individual frames, and two ticked double lines ascend from the top edge of two of the frames. Interpreting these motifs, the men are surrounded by earth and digging upwards. The ticked lines represent a tunnel to the surface. Of the many themes defined by Phillips and Brown, one of the most common, consistent, and recognizable is that of the forked pole. One characteristic of the theme is that, of two figures, only the one on the right ever has his hands on the pole. In the standard version of the theme, the other man is reaching toward the pole with his hands turned thumbs down. That is, one person is holding the pole upright and is responsible for its position. The other person is not responsible for its position. This could be a stylized representation of the pole motif in the migration legend. The man on the right is placing the pole upright in the evening, while the man on the left is discovering it in the morning. In none of the recognizable examples of the theme is the man on the left upright with respect to the pole. Turning the engraving so the man on the left is vertical tilts the pole in the direction which the man faces. If we can conclude that Spiroans told tales of these two types, what does that tell us about life and leadership at Spiro? First, the shaming of the sun is a cosmogonic tale associated with the upper world and maintenance of the proper progression of the sun. We know that the historic Natchez, another group descended from Mississippians, called their chief the Great Sun, so it's not unreasonable to assume that Spiro chiefs were also tasked with maintaining the sun's course. Second, the consistent and repeated appeal to origin myths in the forked pole theme would be a powerful way for leaders to assert control. Those with direct connections to the mythic past have always held great influence and authority. It's also interesting to note that the two themes, the confronted figures and the forked pole, appear on different kinds of artifacts. Confronted figures are only found on gorgets, regalia items worn around the neck, and forked poles are only found on shell cups. It's possible that these two themes of leadership, solar control and the mythic past, related to different leadership contexts, or even different leadership positions within the Spiro community. In conclusion, then, what can this whole endeavor teach us? First, oral narratives seemed utterly beyond the reach of archaeological investigation, but a careful use of techniques and concepts from the field of folkloristics helped to identify at least certain dimensions of spiral narratives. Archaeology can tell us about the cognitive lives of people in the past, but to do so, we must be willing to go beyond sorting potsherds into piles. We must be not just archaeologists, but jacks of all trades in our pursuit of the past. Thank you.